Imagine that we need $1 million to be happy. If that's the case, then as long as we don't reach this amount, we're unhappy. Looking at humanity's poverty and its small percentage of millionaires, we can conclude that happiness is scarce if it requires 7 figures in a bank account. Now, let's say that we deeply desire to be happy and feel incomplete as long as we don't reach this mental state. So far, we've managed to save $100,000, which might be a lot of money to most of us. But if we take the requirement of happiness we've set for ourselves into account, we are $900,000 in debt. It's not comfortable to be in debt, as it weighs heavily on our shoulders and implies a state of owing something, which in this case is a desire left unpaid. Only if we obtain what we want is this debt paid off. If what we need is scarce, it's challenging to get and easy to lose because everyone wants it. In our experience, then, happiness is in short supply. Suppose we let our life satisfaction depend on things challenging to obtain. In that case, we set ourselves up for stress, discontent, and insecurity. We tend to worry a lot about not having what we want, losing what we have, and the future not playing out as we desire. A much better alternative would be a minimalist mindset of abundance. If we experience no shortage in getting our needs met, we'll quickly achieve a state of contentment. And the quickest way to reach abundance is by downgrading our needs. The less you want, the more you have. And when we have plenty, we care less about gain and loss. We're less stressed about missing out and less fearful of change. This video delves into the benefits of being satisfied with little, how this leads to a more carefree life, and how we can experience abundance instead of scarcity through a minimalist mindset. When happiness is in short supply, we need to work hard to obtain it. The requirements for happiness we've decided for ourselves could be material possessions, money, high social status, a near-perfect partner, or perhaps a combination of these factors. Imagine slaving away endlessly to meet these requirements, while continually experiencing this nagging sense of dissatisfaction, because as long as our needs aren't satisfied, we're not happy. Imagine that when we finally obtain our holy grail, we anxiously hold on to it, as losing what we've worked so hard for would mean the end of our happiness. What a demanding life that would be. The more specific our conditions for happiness are, the more difficult it becomes to be satisfied, especially when we've made our happiness dependent on outside circumstances that are incredibly fickle. Even the smallest of changes threaten the foundations of our well-being. An example of this would be a person who desires a perfect life, which entails a perfect house, perfect family, perfect job, perfect social circle, and the list goes on. Satisfaction requires all variables to be fulfilled. But if one of them isn't perfect, then this person's sense of happiness collapses like a house of cards. As the backward law shows us, the more we need to be satisfied, the less satisfied we become, and the more we want, the less we feel we have. So the less we need from the world, the more we'll experience abundance. Abundance implies that we have more than enough. But what's enough? That's subjective. For some, it's never enough. For others, very little is enough. Also, our idea of what's enough tends to change over time. For example, when we're still in college, having enough money to buy food and going to parties tends to be enough. But when we're advanced in our careers, we could very well be dissatisfied with salaries that dwarf the income of most students. The good news is that we can change our perceptions of what's enough. The glass is half full. They have a roof over their heads, Lives small but cozily, and old doesn't always mean unsuitable for living. Even though larger, newer, better-looking houses are available, the places they live in still suit their basic need shelter. There are many people with worse living spaces, or even without homes. Compared to them, any home is a blessing and something to be grateful for. When we shift the paradigm from dissatisfaction to gratitude, the value of the same house increases. We now value and cherish what we previously devalued. Gratitude, therefore, is not just a free-of-charge ticket to satisfaction. It's also a way to save money. Had we satisfied the desire for a new house, we would have eventually ended up with the same level of satisfaction, but we also pay most dearly for it. Contemplating the price of our needs is another important aspect. Our needs come with a price. In general, what's abundant is cheap, and what's scarce is expensive. It's easier to acquire something affordable than something lavish. But still, the level of difficulty depends on our context. Someone wealthy, for example, will have an easy time obtaining a costly watch, which for a poor person could take years of saving money. Even though the watch's price remains the same, it's relatively cheaper for the rich than for the poor. When selecting our needs, it's wise to contemplate what they truly cost us. American philosopher Henry David Thoreau had a simple rule for this. The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it. Whenever we desire something, we could immediately ask ourselves, what amount of life will I exchange for this? How many hours of work does this purchase require of me? And how much does this work affect my health? Things that need a small amount of life in exchange can be considered cheap. Items that require a large amount of life can be regarded as expensive. If we focus on the needs that are cheap and easy to fulfill, we experience abundance. This abundance is either based on having plenty of resources or the minor requirement of life that it takes to fulfill it. Taking an expensive mortgage may not be such a great idea if this requires us to walk on our toes for it. Even though we might buy a dream house eventually, the price could outweigh the benefit. Staying out of long-term debt is crucial for maintaining a sense of abundance and satisfaction. Being in debt can be a very stressful experience, as an obligation to pay off what we owe shackles us. Although we associate debt with money, our desires also generate debt to one of the most tormenting, nagging, demanding creditors we can think of: the mind. How is the mind a creditor? Well, every time we notice that a desire arises within us, we're instantly in debt. We move from the debt-free experience of contentment, in which we owe ourselves nothing as we have no desires need to be paid off, into the red. The mind demands that we fulfill this desire, and if we don't, it keeps knocking on our door like a debt collector. To a certain extent, this is inevitable. For example, when we're hungry, we must satisfy our hunger with food. But real difficulties start when we immerse ourselves in long-term desires that we must fulfill to feel satisfied. By doing this, we burden ourselves with long-term debt, a feeling of lack that only goes away when this desire is fulfilled, which can leave us feeling incomplete for a long time. An example of such a predicament is how some people handle unrequited love. Imagine having romantic feelings for someone, but this person doesn't feel the same way about you. If you're unable to accept this and spend your days hoping that this person someday reciprocates, you've set yourself up for long-term dissatisfaction. Your mind has turned the romantic interest of someone who's not interested into a prerequisite for happiness. So you'll be in debt until the mind gets what it wants, which probably never happens. Hope, therefore, is not a good strategy for happiness. Instead of letting our happiness depend on realizing dreams and desires in the future, especially those that take ages to realize, or we never realize at all, we might want to focus on finding joy in more readily available things. Enjoying the immediate doesn't mean that we shouldn't have long-term goals, but that we appreciate the small things and don't let our lives solely depend on realizing the big. We can generate satisfaction with very little, with what's abundant. But this often means that instead of conquering the world, we need to conquer our desire for the world. Ultimately, there are two ways of creating abundance. The first one is by accumulating more of what we desire. But by doing so, we become dependent on outside circumstances that we cannot control. The second one is by putting a chain on our desires, so we may make the things that are already here in the present more satisfying to us. The less we desire from the world, the more abundant the world appears. Thus, the less you want, the more you have. Thank you.